Native Americans in the northern wilds believed that a vengeful spirit inhabited the untamed wilderness, preying on man and beast alike. A spirit born of desperation and unspeakable sin that warped the bodies and minds of those who would succumb and drive them to feast on their kin and whatever living things they could find. They called it a Wendigo. I couldn't have been older than 10 when my father took us hunting. My father, my older brother Bradley, and me, hiking through the Yukon like actual pioneers or fur traders. Bradley taught me a lot about tracking as we hiked, pointing out tracks in the mud and snow, broken branches, disturbances in the brush. Dad taught him, and he was teaching me. Dad always said it was because of the native blood in his veins that he preferred hunting off the trails and reserves. Looking back, I think it might be because he just didn't feel like paying for permits. We'd made it to the lodge we were staying in just before dusk. Any later would have probably been a death sentence for us, but I was too young to realize at the time. As we sat around the fireplace eating our MREs Dad always kept in stock, I couldn't get something from the trip out of my head that I'd seen on our way up the mountain. It almost looked like a man, but something was just off. It was misshapen, twisted, unnaturally skinny, and had to be at least 8 feet tall. It let out some kind of shrill, inhuman shriek before I watched its macabre, nude form bound off into the trees. Of course, I was the only one that saw it. Bradley and Dad both heard the call, but our dad said it was just an elk. I know what elk sound like, and that definitely wasn't it. This was something predatory, something guttural. My life wasn't the same after that trip. When we got home, I was absolutely consumed with what I'd seen. I even took to calling them Wendies, affectionately. Every piece of media related to the legend, every historical documentation, every book, movie, there's very little I didn't study extensively. When I got a little older, I even joined a message board for cryptid sightings, but results were a lot less than I hoped to find. Crackpots and lunatics raving about Bigfoot and chupacabra and bog beasts. Anyone who claimed to see a Wendigo was completely off their gourd, or their notes didn't line up. I knew I wasn't crazy, I knew what I saw. Eventually I even moved to the Yukon after I graduated, taking up residence in a cabin and working as a dispatcher for a bobcat rental service. I knew that I could be the one to find a real Wendigo and reveal it to the world. That was 30 years ago. The bobcats are gone, but I'm still here. Just me, on the mountain range, in my cabin. At least I can say I became quite the hunter, or else I'd have died years ago. Elk and rabbit have sort of a gamey taste, but when it's all that's around, you get used to it fast. I occasionally run into people at a trading stand located a couple of hours east, but that's usually the extent of my interactions with other people face to face, if hunters don't frequent the lodges that year. I couldn't tell you if Bradley's alive or dead. I'm pretty sure my dad must have died by now. Maybe that's why things went the way they did, but it had to happen. I had to be right. Had to be. What comes next, I need you to not judge me for. To someone removed from the situation, what follows is going to sound cruel, if not particularly gruesome. I'll admit it's never something I would have imagined myself doing when I was younger. Then again, I didn't think I'd do a lot of things. Always wanted to be a zoologist. I guess I still kind of am. Instead of a wife and a house, I had a cabin over an old storm cellar, and a monster I hadn't seen for nearly 40 years. One could say that time sort of ravaged me, or drove me insane, and maybe it did. Maybe it did, but it doesn't change what happened last spring. There was an early thaw last winter that gave way to a freak blizzard in, what the hell was it? I want to say early May. I have trouble keeping track of the months sometimes. It's all seasons to me. Anyway, this wasn't the usual snowstorm. I've seen plenty on the range, but this was something else. This was something almost biblical. High winds, whiteout conditions, dangerously low temperatures. I was fine on supplies for months and set to wait it out in the relative comfort of the cabin until I heard the darnest thing. A chirp on my outside motion sensors. How these people found me, I have no idea. Half frozen to death, damn near breaking my door down. A man, a woman, 2 teenagers, all huddled in the snow. They didn't look well equipped at all for the white hell that was raining down on them, so I didn't really hesitate to bring them inside. My French isn't great, but I was able to gather that they were a family from Quebec that was doing some sightseeing and got caught off guard by the storm. They'd lost their way trying to navigate back to their camper and damn near died before they saw the lights through my windows. They were mostly grateful to get in somewhere warm and lucky enough to find someone willing to share some food. Father Renard, Mother Janine, 13-year-old Benoit, and 15-year-old Gwen. They were all nice enough, happy to be alive. It got pretty clear that they were going to have to stay for a spell until the storm died down and they'd be able to navigate back, but Renard was able to show me on a map where they were trying to get to. Turns out they were way off. After the storm broke, I'd be able to lead them the several kilometers down to their campsite, but they'd have to at least stay the night. There wasn't much room in the main cabin, but I had a few army cots sitting around, and there was plenty of room in the cellar, so I had Renard and Benoit help me move a few things up into the storage closet and set them up down there. As I closed the hatch to give my guests some privacy, I got to thinking. In Wendigo legends, there's always something that causes the creature to come into being. Sometimes it's a curse, or they're born, or it's like a possession thing. But the most common source I've seen has always been one particularly gruesome thing, the act of cannibalism. Man eating man, the most horrific abomination man could think of. Here I was, in a remote suffering wasn't something I wanted to cause, but it was going to happen. They were going to have to be desperate. Desperate enough for the unthinkable. Just before dawn, I threw a bucket down the steps, reclosed the hatch, and locked it down with an old tire chain and a padlock. I could hear them through the floor, confused and startled. Janine made her way up the steps and discovered the hatch wouldn't move. From what I was able to hear, there was the sound of confusion giving way to anxiety. Renard came to the top and gave the hatch quite a shove, only to discover the chain. They did their best to yell and speak to me, and I just kept acting like I couldn't understand them. After all, I don't really speak much French. They must have thought I was crazy at first. I need to make it known that I don't take pleasure in what had to happen, but there's not undoing what happened. I tried to make the situation as pleasant as possible, given the circumstances. The bucket was for whatever bathroom needs they had, and I was still feeding them, just not very much. They were on a liquid diet, all water and smoothies I'd make. From what I understood, it took around 3 weeks with no actual food for starvation to kill a person. Really, I was hoping it wouldn't take that long for one of them to give in and partake, but we had all the time in the world. Eventually, a search party would go looking for them, but we were far enough away from where they would look for them that we wouldn't be disturbed. I thought that the worst part was going to be the screaming, but that mostly stopped by the 3rd day. No, the worst part I felt was the waiting. It was supposed to take 3 weeks, but I honestly lost track of the days and couldn't tell you how long they were down there. I don't know if I'd forgotten a stash of food down there or if they were rationing, but they were holding on. Waiting on anything for weeks on end is torture, but waiting for people to die and eat each other, that's a whole other animal. One morning, I accidentally found a way to expedite the process a bit. I popped the hatch up a bit to roll their fluids down, and Benoit's arm grabbed my pant leg and damn near gave me a heart attack. I'm not exactly sure what he was planning, but he was holding on as tight as his malnourished arm could hold. With my other foot, I stomped down on the hatch a good 2 or 3 times, breaking the boy's arm. He finally pulled it back in, and I could hear him screaming in agony after falling back down the stairs. The sound of his arm breaking under my foot was absolutely stomach-turning, and I had to turn up some music just to drown out his screams. His parents pled with me for medical attention, but there wasn't anything I could do. If they got out, the experiment would be ruined. It wasn't long at all before Benoit's injury became infected. He was a tough kid and held on for as long as he could, but nature took its course. When I heard Janine wailing one night, I knew he was gone. I figured he would be the main course, so to speak, and resolved to cut off their rations until they finally ate him, but then the smell kicked in a couple of days after he passed. It was absolutely putrid coming through the floorboards, and I had to dispose of him. I just couldn't handle the smell. I made my way down the steps with my hunting rifle and ordered the family to the wall. They were definitely thinning, but they were holding on. When I realized I wasn't going to be able to drag the boy's body up the stairs by myself, I had to enlist Renard's help. One thing I'll say is that I absolutely respect Renard. That could not have been an easy thing to do, but he did it for his family. We managed to get the body up the stairs and out the door when he decided to try something stupid. Renard threw a punch that caught me across the jaw, but the force sent him stumbling over. I assume it was the last of his energy going into that punch. When he struggled to his feet to swing at me again, I smashed him in the head with the butt of my rifle. It must have been too hard of a strike, because he immediately went down and started convulsing, with his feet twitching and feebly kicking around in the snow. I'd fucked this man up beyond what I could repair at this point, and did the only merciful thing, shooting him in the head. As I stood in front of my cabin, surrounded by melting snow and 2 dead captives, another idea crossed my mind. When my dad took my brother and me hunting, he insisted that we did our part in every step of our kill, from tracking and stalking, to the actual killing, all the way to field dressing and processing. I discovered really quickly that processing a human being isn't that much different from a deer or any other big game. Less fur, different proportions, but the process and a lot of the cuts are the same. I was hesitant about taking anything from Benoit, since his infection had obviously killed him, and I didn't know how it would affect the meat. Couldn't exactly risk the girls getting sick and dying. Fortunately, Renard still had some usable meat in him, despite being emaciated. I was able to get a few decent slices out of him, and then I got to work in the kitchen. Another day and a half passed, before I peered down the hatch, and laid out 2 bowls of stew. Gwen was clearly starving, and nearly ate it before Janine smacked it from her hand, knowing immediately something was wrong. She demanded to know where her husband was, but of course, that was between me and him. After that, there was no more water or smoothies, just day after day of stew set on the top step. 4 days passed before hunger finally took over, and Janine stopped resisting Gwen's desire to put anything in her stomach. I don't know if Gwen just didn't know she was eating her father, or if she just didn't care at that point. Initially, I was disappointed to see that all Gwen had seemed to develop was a stomach bug, vomiting violently into their shit bucket. I was starting to lose hope. Had I wasted my life jazzing a ghost story? Had I abducted and terrorized a family for nothing? These thoughts tortured me the entire day, until I started hearing what sounded like Gwen having a seizure in the cellar. The thumping and flopping gave way to some strange animalistic growling, with Janine weakly trying to comfort her daughter. The next morning, it happened. I finally heard it. The sound I'd waited my whole life to hear again. The shriek of a Wendigo. I opened the hatch and investigated to see Gwen, or what used to be Gwen, nude, hunched over her mother's corpse, tearing pieces of the abdomen out and mindlessly eating them. Her body was warped, nearly skeletal, as she used her newly developed claws to tear chunks of flesh from Janine. Her head snapped in my direction with an unnatural quickness, shedding clumps of hair with each twitch. Her face had completely warped, with blood and sick covering a mouth of jagged fangs with flesh stuck between the teeth, and eyes that had gone from a dark green to a corpse-like pale blue. She lunged across the cellar at me, but I was able to dive back up the hatch and relock the padlock before she reached the top of the stairs. The chain was holding, but barely, as it fearfully slammed against the trapdoor. Now I was faced with a conundrum that I hadn't thought of before. The Wendigo was real. I'd made it, but how the hell was I going to get it out of my house? I didn't stand a chance of fighting it off if I opened the hatch, and the chain wasn't going to hold forever, so time was a factor. I had to rely on its predatory instincts and pray it would go for an easy meal. Benoit was still in the shed, I remembered. He was putrid and beginning to bloat, but I doubted it was going to care at that point. I dragged the corpse into my living room, and it certainly sensed that there was food, as the slamming against the trapdoor got even more desperate. I positioned Benoit toward the kitchen nook, and then took a position behind the trapdoor where I unlocked the chain and took a step back as quietly as I could. It climbed out of the hatch, crawling around the room on all fours, sniffing aggressively, eventually making its way to its brother's body. From what I could tell, it didn't seem to be able to see that well. What used to be Gwen was aware of me, but seemed content with the easy meal for the time being. While the four-wheeler in the shed wasn't the ideal getaway vehicle, it worked out fine as I sped down the hill. As I drove down the trail, I was able to hear the distinct call of a Wendigo echo through the trees again. I stayed at the empty shack that housed the Bobcat rentals for 2 days, while I waited to make sure the Wendigo had left, and when I went home, it was gone. Only a bloody mess, and what was most of a teenage boy's skeleton, and a blood trail leading to the trees. I'm not crazy. Wendigos are real, and I saw 2 in my life with my own eyes. I still hear it scream in the woods, and sometimes I even catch glimpses of it. I haven't gotten a picture yet, but I'm hopeful. Every now and again I'll find its handiwork, elk and other animals ripped to shreds. I don't expect her to move on anytime soon. What with hunting season starting soon on the mountain again, it'll have prey aplenty, and I'll be able to study it up close. It also seems drawn to my house, and likes to stay close by. Maybe it senses I'm food, or maybe it's drawn back from some vague memories of where it was born. Every so often I see it on the monitor when it comes close enough to set off a perimeter sensor, and every time I hear its guttural screech echo through the trees, I can't help but chuckle. Everyone knows it's Wendy. I was saved from a skinwalker. For about a year and a half I 22 male dated my ex 23 male who was Native American, specifically Navajo. Our relationship got serious enough that we introduced each other to our parents. He and his family lived close to our college, so I would go over there quite frequently for dinner or just to visit. During spring break his parents invited me to come with them to a log cabin they and their extended family had rented for a weekend. I accepted and honestly got kind of excited as I felt like my BF and I were moving up in our relationship. I also could count the number of family vacations I had taken growing up on one hand, so there was that. The night before we drove to the cabin my BF's parents invited me over for dinner, and after they sat me down to talk to me about the next couple days. I already knew my BF's grandparents were extremely in touch with Navajo traditions, and could be harsh to certain people they saw as outsiders. They basically explained that they may not accept me immediately, and that they apologized if at any point they offended me. I thought about what they said the entire drive to the cabin, and it honestly only made me even more nervous the closer we got to our destination. Meeting a boyfriend's family for the first time was stressful enough, but adding on the fact we were the same gender, and that his family may view me as an outsider, made my chest unbearably tight. As we drove up to the cabin, immediately we saw that there was a group standing outside of it. My BF's dad parked the car. He and his wife jumped out to run over to the crowd to see what the issue was. The yelling was so loud you could hear it almost clearly, despite us still being in the car. I asked my BF who the people were, and he said they were all different family members, and that a serious argument must have broken out. We got out of the car and walked around to the front of it so we could see what was going on. It looked like it was about 9 people yelling at one guy. The guy's had his back to us, but I remember his bizarre way of standing. It's hard to describe, but if I had to give a comparison, it would be Mr. Crocker from Fairly Odd Parents. The argument was so heated it looked like nearly everyone was ready to start throwing punches. Finally, the guy with his back to us yelled something, before turning and walking in our direction. I thought he was walking directly towards us, but then I realized he was on the path to walking past us. As he walked by me, I remember he looked at me really quick, and we made eye contact. His hair was long and shaggy and came down over his face, but I could still see his eyes. They looked immensely glazed over, like the guy was beyond high. Despite nothing technically being off about him, it just felt like I had looked into the eyes of mannequin or something. Getting over my uneasiness, I noticed the guy hadn't walked to a car, but instead had continued to walk until he walked into the woods. I turned to my BF and asked where he was going and who that was, and he said that he was pretty sure it was one of his uncles, but he hadn't seen him since he was a kid. We both assumed the guy had maybe went to blow off some steam. My boyfriend's parents came back and said everything was fine now, and that we could take our bags out the car to head inside. Log cabin was honestly an understatement. The house they had rented out for weekend was massive. It had enough rooms, where everyone's personnel family had their own rooms. I was beyond shocked to learn that my BF's parents had gotten us our own room, although it was the smallest. We settled down, and then I got to go around and meet my boyfriend's family. Unexpectedly, everyone was beyond nice. I kind of felt like I'd be treated like an outsider given how traditional my BF had said his extended family was, but nearly everyone I met greeted me with a giant hug and warming smile. I guess the two exceptions were my BF's grandparents. Both seemed very contained and had this very serious look on their faces. As I approached them to introduce myself to them, they both looked me over a couple of times before moving. Soon they both stood and gave me a very strong-handed handshake and pat on the shoulder. It wasn't a dream come true loving welcome, but it was at least a gesture of acceptance. As the night went on, everyone in the house talked, drank, ate, and even had a period where one family member brought a guitar out and we all drunkenly sung covers of popular songs. I had an amazing time, and it was defiantly a night I wouldn't forget. I do, however, remember this tense feeling that was with me the entire night. Like something was around me but that I couldn't see. The night flew by, and before long it was sometime after 1 a.m. and everyone was ready to go to bed. Before anyone made their way to the room for the night, my BF's grandfather called everyone into the living room for a family meeting. I figured I was a guest, so that included me, but before I was able to grab a seat, several male family members told me I wasn't allowed to be here for this, and that I had to go upstairs. I was kind of disheartened by this, but I made my way up to my room. To be fair, I wasn't alone, as the Caucasian wife of some member of the family was also not allowed to sit in on the meeting. I went upstairs, showered, and went to my room to mess around on my phone until my boyfriend came upstairs. While I waited, I got a sudden surge of anxiety. I don't know where it came from, but my heart just started racing, and it felt like I was about to cry. It lasted for only a minute or so, but freaked me out big time. After it ended, I sat there confused and slightly shaking. My BF walked in, and seeing him settled me down. I didn't feel the need to mention it to him as he defiantly laughed at me. He showered, we talked for a bit about the day, we did what a couple tends to do when in bed at night, then we both went to sleep. That night I shot up out of my sleep. I wasn't having a nightmare, I wasn't even having a dream. Suddenly I was awake and vaulted out of bed. Standing there, I was confused as hell as to why my body had jolted itself awake. I thought maybe my BF had kicked the shit out of me or suddenly snatched all the covers, but when I looked down at him, he was calmly snoring with my side of the covers thrown over him from me vaulting awake. I looked at the clock, and it read 4:10. I was kind of freaked out by my weird wake up, but I realized I had to pee, so I threw on my t-shirt and shorts and left our room to make my way to the bathroom at the end of the hall. After doing my business, I walked out of the bathroom and into the hallway. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway and sat next to a window. I stopped at the window to take in the nighttime scenery. I looked at the moon casting light over the family's parked cars. What stole my attention away from the cars was a figure moving among the crowd of vehicles. I couldn't tell what it was, but I just watched as it walked up and down the rows of cars. I figured it was someone maybe looking for their car in the darkness of the night, but as my eyes adjusted, the figure clearly wasn't walking like a person. It looked like a black dog or wolf or something four-legged. We were in a heavily wooded area, so I figured it wasn't abnormal for wildlife to wander close to the house. But then the figure stood up. It didn't stand, wobble around, then plant its front legs on the ground. It stood and continued moving through the rows of cars. I watched as the thing walked with a stiff gait around the vehicles before it just stopped to face the house. The darkness seemed to coat the creature as I couldn't make out any of its features other than its outline. Then it simply looked up at me. Not in the sky or up at the house, but at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me directly. From its dark form I saw two small white dots on its head. Just two pinpoint-like dots that stared at me from outside. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but what I do know was that before I knew it, I was walking downstairs and to the front door. I just moved, no reason or want to, but my body was suddenly in motion. As I unlocked the front door, an iron-like hand grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. I looked over and saw my BF's granddad standing there staring at me with a look that I'll never forget. He didn't say anything, he just relocked the door and turned me to face him. I saw him play something against the door before he pulled out something from his pocket with a light. He lit it and circled it around my head, saying something under his breath. I remember being utterly confused but just completely submissive to whatever was going on. As he finished, he used his fingers to put out whatever he lit and told me to go back upstairs. Slowly I moved back towards the stairs, but as I turned around, I saw him pick up what I realized was a shotgun from off a doorframe. I walked upstairs and stopped before entering my room. I looked at the window and didn't even have to walk over to it to know that that thing was still out there. I laid back in bed and after about 30 minutes of ceiling watching I went back to sleep. It was easily the worst sleep I'd ever gotten. I had what felt like 24 hours worth of nightmares that was just me running from something. I was running in slow motion and could hear something fast running after me. Right as I heard it get to me, the dream would restart. I woke up later that morning around 10 a.m. or so and saw my BF was covered in sweat as he slept. He never sweated while he slept, and the room was a cool 64 degrees, so I found it disturbing. I literally had to shake him for about 5 minutes before he woke up. At first, he just dreamily stared straight ahead before he registered I was looking over him. I can honestly tell you that my boyfriend is a part of our college's ROTC program, and he is used to waking up early. 99% of the time he would wake up 2 hours before me when he slept over. Not to mention in the rare cases that he did sleep longer than me, he would snap awake whenever I touched him. He lazily got dressed before we both went downstairs to find the entire house in a dreamlike state. Everyone moved through the house like zombies, and everyone seemed half dead. Before anyone worked on breakfast, my BF's grandfather called for another family meeting. I was still not allowed to listen, but this one lasted much longer than the last. When it was over, my BF and his parents told me we were packing up and leaving. I couldn't argue as everyone in the house simultaneously moved to their rooms to pack up their items. Within an hour everyone had packed up and placed their belongings in their cars. As we drove away from the massive cabin, I couldn't help but feel like those same small whites watching us from just out of sight. During the ride home, my BF, the car was quiet. When we stopped to get gas, I tried to ask my BF why he had left, but he just looked at me and said it was hard to explain. Even after they dropped me back off at my campus apartment, I wondered if the reason the trip had been cancelled was because of the figure I had seen that night, as well as the dreamlike state everyone had woken up in. Up until we broke up, I would ask my ex why the trip had been cancelled, and he never really gave a direct answer. He'd just say that I wouldn't understand or that it was a family dispute. It wasn't until after we broke up that I saw a documentary on skinwalkers. It made me shudder to think what would have happened if I had opened that door and walked outside. There's a skinwalker in my neighborhood. I had heard of skinwalkers before, but always just assumed they were the Native American version of werewolves, so I never gave them much thought. Until last week, when one of the co-workers at my new job told me that they were his most feared folklore creatures. He's originally from Utah, so that makes sense. He suggested some YouTube videos to watch on the subject, and after work that night I binged about 4 or 5 of the videos. I totally understand his stance on them now. I live in rural South Carolina, so to be completely honest, I wasn't too worried about the possibility of running into one. My co-worker told me that they're basically a Midwestern thing. I'd be more worried about Wendigos if I were you. He joked the day after I watched the videos. We had a good chat about skinwalkers and Wendigos during our shift and just reveled in the creepiness of them. I mentioned how one of the tales said that the more you talk about skinwalkers, the more they're drawn to you, and he made sarcastic ghost noises to keep the mood light. That night I showed the videos to my fiancée. She was way more creeped out than I was. I became kind of obsessed. I love scary things, and couldn't help but watch every video I came across. I discussed skinwalkers with my other horror enthusiast friends, looked up skinwalker art, read true skinwalker stories on Reddit, just dove headfirst into all things skinwalker. This went on for a few days until I started feeling a little burned out on the subject. I live in a fairly nice neighborhood where all the houses are on one side of the street. On the other side is property that used to belong to the local elementary school. The building is on the next street over, so basically it was like the school's backyard or whatever. The school shut down about 30 or 40 years ago, and the county just let nature reclaim the. So directly across from my house is an old chain link fence and just overgrown woods. 2 nights ago while I was smoking a cigarette, I heard leaves rustling across the street. I didn't bother looking up from my phone. I live across from woods, it was probably a deer. The rustling stopped, then started again, and it sounded like whatever was over there was running back and forth along the fence line, panting like a dog. This caught my attention. There had been a few rabies cases in my town 2 months back, so a strange dog running around in the middle of the night was definitely something I'd want to keep an eye on. I look up from my phone in the direction of the sounds and they just stop. It was like the thing knew I noticed it. I strained my eyes trying to see what it was, but it was obscured by the overgrowth. I didn't look away, must have stared at the spot for at least a minute. It didn't make another sound, didn't move again, so I knew it was still there. A chill ran down my spine, and I began thinking of every Skinwalker video I had watched over the last week, and I felt sick to my stomach. I quickly put out my cigarette and went inside. The next morning, I took my dog out for a short walk. She's a pug zoo named Honey and is like my child. Me and my fiancé taught her that pee-pee-po-po means it's time to go outside to potty. It's the cutest thing. Anyway, this particular morning I take her out to the front yard to do her business. She pees and then walks around sniffing for about 5 minutes before walking to the side of the street and sitting down. She's never done this before, so I was a little annoyed. I tugged on her leash lightly and tried to coax her back toward the house. "Come on, honey. Got to po-po." She didn't budge. This dog could be stubborn sometimes, but this was something else. She tugged back against the leash and just stared across the street, sniffing the air occasionally. It was then that I realized she was staring at the exact spot that I heard the thing the night before. I got goosebumps, and I quickly picked her up and began walking back to the house. As I got closer, I noticed something on the ground by my front steps. It was one of the Halloween decorations my fiancé had hung up on our house. Plastic black roses with plastic eyeballs and spiders on them. The stems were wire so they can be wrapped around things to keep them secured. This flower was torn apart. Something had come onto my porch, taken down the flower, and torn it apart, leaving it lying in front of my steps. I picked up the flower and threw it away. I didn't tell my fiancé. I didn't want her freaking out. The rest of that day went by uneventfully. That night I told my co-worker about what happened, and he looked a little concerned, but brushed it off. Said what I heard was most likely just a dog, and the flower was probably knocked down by the wind. I had my doubts. As I was walking to my door after getting home from work last night, I heard that same panting as the night before, and the clicking of claws against asphalt. I turned quickly to see a dog that looked like a brown mangy bull terrier hauling ass down my street. The street is probably about 40 feet away from my front porch, so I couldn't get a great look at it, but I could tell it was only running on 3 legs because one looked mangled. It turned quickly and darted into the tree line across the street through a part of the fence that had been pulled back. The fence wasn't like that earlier that day. That's when I noticed that the dog didn't have a tail. I almost threw up. Skinwalker legends say that when they take the form of an animal, they never have tails. I tried to rationalize it to myself. Maybe it just had a stub tail that I missed because it was running. I immediately went inside. My fiancé was sitting on the couch petting Honey. She could see I was upset and asked me what was wrong. I told her nothing, just almost got clipped by a car before I pulled into the driveway. She got up, hugged me, and cursed the person that almost hit me. She asked me if I could take Honey out for pee-pee-po-po, because she had been creeped out by all the spooky videos we've been watching, and didn't feel comfortable going outside at night by herself. Honey perked up. She ran to the door and looked between me and the door, whining excitedly. I stared down at her for a moment, before agreeing to it. I'll just keep her close to the porch, I thought. We walked off the porch, and she immediately tried to walk to the street. I tugged on the leash and she tugged back. She eventually moseyed to the edge of the porch and peed. After, she began walking around sniffing. I told her the usual line. "Come on, honey. Gotta poo-poo." She huffed at me, sniffed around some more, and eventually started pooping. I was on edge the entire time we were outside, but being around her helped calm me down a little. Then I heard it from across the street. "Come on, honey. My voice, in the exact same tone and inflection as I had just said it. It sounded staticky, like an old radio broadcast. But it was definitely my voice. Honey stopped what she was doing and stood alert. She looked over to me and cocked her head. "Come on, honey. Got a po-po." Again, my voice called from across the street. Honey began whining, looking from me to the woods across the street. I picked her up and began backing up to the steps, not taking my eyes off the part of the fence that had been pulled back. "Honey, come." The voice sounded firm now, like it was getting aggravated. Honey squirmed in my arms, whining. I didn't know if she was trying to get out to go to the voice or to run inside, but I wasn't taking any chances. I turned and bolted up the steps and to the door. As I walked inside, I turned one last time to look across the street. There, standing in the part of the fence that was pulled back, was the dog. Its eyes were glowing a dull orange, and it had its teeth bared. The face was all wrong, like someone had taken a distortion tool and just dragged around random features. Once again, I didn't tell my fiancée. Stupid horror movie cliché shit, I know. But I really don't want her losing her shit. I just told her there's a strange dog running around the neighborhood, so to not take Honey out at night. Later last night after we had gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth outside my window. Against my better judgment, I rolled over to try and see it. I don't, but the pacing stops. "Come on, honey." My voice called out, cutting through the quiet of the night. I prayed my fiancé didn't hear. It called out 2 more times before I heard it walking away. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. Today when I get to work, I'm going to ask my co-worker what I can do to get rid of this thing. I'm scared. I don't think there's a way. If anyone knows anything, please let me know.